Edward Field, the poet I most consider my mentor, tried harder than anyone else to get me to publish at least some of my work after I contacted him in the late 1990s or early 2000s. Anyway, Ed is still alive, having turned 99 on June 7th, 2023, the day before my sister, Esther, would have turned 75 had she not died young. In my opinion, Ed is the most underappreciated of all living American poets who, unlike me, tried to and did get published. I think the main reason for Ed's relative obscurity is that the Academy has no use for poets like him, whose work speaks for itself in no uncertain terms. Ed is well aware of this, as you'll soon hear when I pay mini tribute to him by reading two selections from his book, A Frieze, Frieze, for A Temple of Love, published in 1998. The first is a prose/poetry piece from the final third of the book, a section called The Poetry File. Ed calls this letter to the New York Times never sent. I want to register my protest at the way the book review presents poetry as the dreariest of academic disciplines, an exercise in language, making it so conventional and safe that no one could possibly care about it. I never wanted to write poetry that sounded like poetry, and I still don't want the language of my poems to be noticeable or distracting, so that the poem can talk straight to the heart and the mind. But the critics fashionably concentrate on language. Even the editors are first looking for language, fancy, self-conscious, odd, willed, language that stands out, or it's not poetry for them. My language is criticized as cliché because it's based on the way I talk, but Auden and Cavafy, that's W.H. and Constantine, were both plain-spoken poets. It's worth noting here that both were gay. Gay poets, I think, may have less to lose by being plain-spoken once they acknowledge their gayness. Anyway, after Ed cites Auden and Cavafy, he presents a little bit of verse. I'm suspicious of fancy language. I always imagine the most elegant poets have shitty toilets, dirty asses. In their lives they're dirty. And like everyone, do dirty things. Even Stevens, Wallace, the poet who, among other things, made a big deal out of placing a jar in Tennessee. Even Stevens, too pure ever to use the words I like to think of, holding his cock and farting with gusto. The second selection is a shortish poem from the first part of the book. The poem is called At the Gates of Heaven. At the Gates of Heaven. Did you hear about the 3 nuns who were killed in an automobile accident? When they appeared at the gates of heaven, expecting to be automatically admitted, St. Peter said that first they would each have to give the correct answer to a question. The nuns, still in shock from their accident, looked at each other with alarm. "Nun number 1, St. Peter roared. Who was the first man?" In a nervous little voice, she answered, "Adam?" "Correct," Peter cried, and a blast of trumpets welcomed her into heaven. Nun number 2 was ready to faint as Peter turned on her his terrible gaze. And who was the first woman?
Eve, she answered, breathless.
Again Peter cried, correct, and the gates swung open for her too. By now, nun number 3 was in a complete tizzy when St. Peter asked, "And what were the first words Eve spoke to Adam?" Nun number 3 went white as a sheet, put her hand to her face, and moaned, "Gee, that's a hard one." And heavenly trumpets blared. She sprouted wings, and in she flew.